Most psychiatric medication is palliative in the sense that it's being taken every day for an indefinite amount of time. Similarly, most non-medical interventions, like let's say psychotherapy, which you don't need a diagnosis to receive, are billed in a certain way. You get like a 50-hour block, and like that's how you get billed, and your insurance will cover it in this context, and MDMA therapy is a bit complex because it combines those things. So it has a lot of hours of therapy, and it has a drug that actually only gets taken like a handful of times. So it's actually more helpful to think about MDMA therapy as surgery as opposed to a psychiatric medication, because it's more like an intervention. It's a short-term thing that has a high cost, but it's a short amount of time, and it has long-term health benefits, as opposed to a drug which maybe you only pay 70 cents a day per pill or whatever, but then that adds up over a lifetime. We're in the process now where we're going to have to go through a pretty intensive negotiation process with insurance companies to make sure that they understand that MDMA therapy is actually more cost effective for them.
Welcome to Voices of Esalen. I'm Sam Stern. My guest today is Ismail Ali, Policy and Advocacy Counsel for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, otherwise known as MAPS. His job is advocating to eliminate barriers to psychedelic therapy and research by developing and implementing legal and policy strategy. Ismail and I discuss the history of the war on drugs, the differences between drug decriminalization and legalization, how MAPS has been able to achieve specific goals with the FDA under the Trump administration, Joe Biden's drug policy history with regards to the R.A.V.E. Act and the crime bill, how medical insurance plays into a landscape where psychedelics may become medicalized, how MAPS has become a thought leader with regards to social justice within the field of psychedelics, and whether Ismail believes psychedelics can bestow a knowledge of unity, oneness, and connectedness that can affect views and policy on racism, environmentalism, and more. You know, I thought it might be useful to start off this conversation by asking you to define the difference between decriminalization and legalization while we're talking about drugs and psychedelics.
Yeah, this is a really important thing to really drill in on, especially right now, because there's such a push to create policy change around the field. And there's a lot of different strategies for what that policy change can look like, and desired outcomes depending on, your ideology, your theory of change, what you think about human nature, what you think about drugs. There's a lot of opinions, I guess is what I'm saying. And, reasonable people disagree about a lot of them. So I think that it's good to have some of this clarification, but in some ways it's quite simple. So when most people use the term decriminalization, they're talking about reducing or eliminating criminal penalties, which just means getting, let's say, crimes or behavior related to drugs outside of the criminal system. So that's just about the criminalization, which in other words, can you get arrested and prosecuted for a certain behavior? So decriminalization just means we're removing the power of the state or of the city or the federal government or whatever to prosecute behavior, to restrict your freedom because of some action that you're taking. Legalization, and sometimes used interchangeably with regulation. Regulation usually implies legalization. What legalization means is that there's actually some sort of a neutral or affirmative structure that actually creates access to it. So whereas decriminalization might make it so selling is no longer illegal, under a decriminalized scheme, you couldn't just get a business license from your city zoning, whatever, and start a business doing a thing. All of that secondary stuff, anything that involves it entering a legal market, that falls in the category of regulation. So usually when people are talking about legalization, they're talking about a regulated system that a product can get to a market. Whereas decriminalization, they're only talking about reducing the criminal penalty. And in the best case scenario, you actually kind of need both to some extent or another for the safest possible paradigm.
Okay, good. So this is really good to kind of define these terms before we get started here.
Yeah.
You're advocacy and legal policy advisor for MAPS. So I'm curious, what does MAPS hope to do from a legal perspective, speaking broadly, I guess?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the core strategy that people are most familiar with respect to MAPS is the process of taking, MDMA through the FDA approval process. What that means on a commercial legalization sense is that we're actually trying to turn this molecule into a product that can then be sold on the kind of medical market the way that pharmaceuticals are. The significant thing from a policy perspective that this implies is that right now we live in this system where the way that drugs are categorized is based on their perception of harm and their toxicity, and basically how risky is this substance? Does it have any sort of use in a medical context or not? right now, marijuana is probably one of the best examples because it has so much research showing that it has medical value, but it's still on Schedule 1 because the FDA itself has not said there's medical value because no one has taken marijuana through the FDA. We're trying to, and that's one of the other things that MAPS is doing. But so similarly, MDMA is currently Schedule 1. If we were to get FDA approval, what that does is that kind of triggers a finding that the MDMA has medical value. If it has medical value as defined by the FDA, the DEA can't put it in a category that requires it to have no medical value to be in that category. So in other words, medicalizing MDMA would require MDMA to be taken off of Schedule 1, which could have secondary effects on sentencing, arrests, and so on. So that's kind of like, from a policy perspective, that's really the theory. It's like, if you can get, the government to acknowledge medical use, then the way that the government treats that drug from that point forward needs to be different. I do want to put a little caveat though, because there are other drugs that are not Schedule 1, that are Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, like Oxycontin or ketamine or others, cocaine even, that are still highly criminalized. So we'll be able to, maybe take MDMA off of Schedule 1 and put it into Schedule 2 or 3 or 4 or 5, where other pharmaceutical drugs are. But there's still going to be more effort to actually make sure that there's change in the criminal law so people also don't get prosecuted for it.
I want to ask for a little bit of a clarification around federal versus like state rules, legalities. Is part of what you do at MAPS, is it all on the federal level, or do you try to attack legalities within different states?
It's a great question. So most of what we've done for most of our history has occurred at the federal level. And most of the work that we do with respect to the FDA, for example, is entirely at the federal level. There are a few things that have to happen at the state level. I'll just give one quick example. So we were just talking about the process of rescheduling. What triggers rescheduling? About 50% of the states right now automatically reschedule when the federal government does, and about 50% don't. So in about 24, 25 states, we're going to have to go to those states and be like, hey, the federal government changed the thing. Can you change it too? So we can actually, bring MDMA into this state as well. So there's a multi-track thing. And to get to your kind of the early point of your question, criminal enforcement mostly, like by volume, mostly occurs at the state level. So most arrests, prosecutions, judgments, all of that happens like within state systems. But the federal government does have like a criminal system and does some criminal acts, especially ones that occur between states, happen at the federal level. So up until about 2 years ago, I would say we really didn't focus at all on anything local or state. We were really fixated on the federal work. And I'm sure we'll get more into this, but like, because there's been so much openness and change or possibility for change on the political spectrum over the last really 2 years, especially, we've kind of been forced in a good way to actually pay attention to what's happening at the state and local level, because 2 years ago doing something at the state level was just like, or 4 years ago even, it was just a total dream, right? It was like not even realistically on the table. And I think now that we've seen actual policy proposals succeed in cities and in some states, there's actually a real conversation to be had there. So we're kind of in the process now of figuring out, well, what's the most like harmonious relationship for us as MAPS, between these different systems, knowing that they all kind of fit into one another in different ways.
Right. Yeah. So like, for example, can you speak about the water cooler talk at your work, the Wednesday morning after the election, when, for example, a drug decriminalization bill gets passed like it did in Oregon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, long story short, we were really stoked. Just as to back up just a tiny bit, I don't know. We have, especially the policy department that I work with at MAPS, like we have been in dialogue with advocates at various like levels of some of these systems. We had some conversations early on with the people that were working on Measure 109 and are closely allied to Deep Drug Policy Alliance and others that are involved in Measure 110 in Oregon. So we were kind of like watching from the sidelines, in like the months leading up, and kind of stepped out of an active role, like really like, we sent out some emails to make sure to get at the vote and so on. But otherwise, we're pretty like hands off of this process. Partially because we think it's really important that when there are community-led grassroots efforts or efforts that are kind of geographically based for a certain state, that they work with people in that state, right? We're really careful about not wanting to like push policy outside of like our range, if you will, our lane. But we were stoked. I don't think anyone, or I would say few people really expected there to be like a sweep, where not only the two bills that you're talking about in Oregon that decriminalized drugs and created a regulated system for psilocybin services, but also 5 states legalized cannabis, including a number of states in the South. Like the fact that it was such a clear sweep, it was like, I was telling people that week that drug policy was like the belle of the ball. Like everyone was like, ooh, drug policy. Wow. You like really got that bipartisan support, didn't you? You know, like that's something that was like so hard to find, especially in the weeks and months leading up to this election. So we were really excited. And I think, feel both like a sense of like really cautious, strong optimism for what could happen, and also caution because if we learned anything from, you know, the rollout to the marijuana movement that then became a marijuana industry, some of the concerns that people have around the legalization, actual entering of the market, the commercialization of a product, those also come up against very real issues with how our economy currently functions around, you know, the hyper focus on profit maximization, the kind of targeted advertising. There's a lot of aspects about the current economic model that are really concerning and that could be harmful if they're applied to drugs. So we're like both really excited about these big changes and also like, okay, what are the safeguards we need to put in now? So in 5 years when there's like a psychedelic industry, and I've just gotten used to saying those words together, you know, but like in 5 years, if and when we do end up in a position where there's like a lot of access to a lot of different substances in different contexts, that we minimize the likelihood of the current kind of market forces kind of perverting whatever goodness people really hope to see with access to these medicines. So.
So interesting. And there's so much there to unpack. I mean, psychedelics industry, that's the first time I've heard that term. We do, however, live within the system of capitalism. And if we're really talking about a broad access for all peoples, it feels like the movement needs to be subsumed into this system, and it's going to need to make money for people all across the board.
Totally. I might be naive here. And I do think that there's like a very real, I think that word subsumed is really interesting because I also believe that there's a lot of, I'll put it this way, there's a lot of energy within this emerging industry and to shift business as usual. But I've also heard that a lot, you know, people say that a lot. And I think it really remains to be seen what that balance is going to be, to your point. Like, well, yeah, we do need to scale. If we are talking about access on a mass scale, there are certain kind of forces and frameworks that we're going to need to engage with and entangle with. And I think the extent to which, like basically, what is that negotiation going to look like, I think, between like capital and industry and like this particular substance, which I think will resist being treated as like a simple product for as long as possible. But we'll see, because there are a lot of questions around like how to actually make it not just, you know, literally physically accessible, but also understandable and translatable into all these different kind of paradigms and worldviews.
Well, can you talk a little bit about the perspective that MAPS comes to this issue from? And MAPS is a nonprofit. Is that correct?
So MAPS is a nonprofit, 501c3, which is what I work for. But MAPS is the sole owner of a public benefit corporation, now a second one actually in a similar corporation in Europe. And I'll start with like the model and then go into kind of answering your question. So MAPS was founded as a nonprofit a little bit, you know, over 30 years ago. But in 2014, so just about 6-7 years ago, MAPS kind of split into or created a subsidiary to actually hold where the clinical research would happen. And the long-term vision for this is to have a structure that works within a public benefit corporation model, which in short basically just means that there's some other goal besides profit maximization. Basically, we're in this position where there's a public benefit corporation that's fully owned by the nonprofit. So the public benefit corp both already has a mandate to pursue something that isn't just profit, which is great. And because the only shareholder of that public benefit corporation is MAPS, the nonprofit, we're kind of in a position with this hybrid organization that we can pursue our drug development work, entirely on donations, which is mostly a big deal because, it's a big deal for a few different reasons, but one of the core pieces here is that most drug development is done obviously through investment, and it's done usually to the range of like $1 billion per drug for a lot of new drugs. We will have probably approved MDMA with about $100 million, which is not a small amount of money, but it's quite small relative to the way that many new drugs are developed and kind of put to the market. And the idea is that the funds that come out of that, the revenue that comes out of selling MDMA, training therapists, developing whatever kind of infrastructure gets developed for that commercialization, comes back to the nonprofit for the work that we're doing. And we work more in kind of the field of harm reduction, drug education, and policy advocacy. So the idea is to really have like the sale of MDMA be an engine for continued kind of policy change and drug war reform and so on. So it's kind of an interesting model. It's very exciting. And I think the possibility is very enticing. And I think it's very interesting to see like what that actually ends up looking like. And for our perspective, we're really trying to find this balance, to your point earlier, of being able to engage with the market in a meaningful way, like be a nonprofit counter to the many for-profit actors that they're going to be, while also really holding a very high standard for things like training. And I think like one of the big tensions that we're going to see emerge in the next few years is how to do something like training. Like our training, for example, at MAPS for the MDMA PTSD program is very extensive. It takes weeks. There's pre-training that's required. There's like a whole process of supervision and so on. It costs a lot of money. And I think for the sake of like, really rapidly getting access to this medicine and having access to the facilitators, which is necessary for the kind of work that we do. It's, there's nuance there, but for the kind of work that we're doing, it's really part of it. So I think that like the approach has really been, how do we make sure that our information is as open as possible? We're very focused on open science. We freely publish everything we come out with. We pay for all of our stuff to be put onto open science kind of platforms. And all of the information that we find about MDMA, investigators' brochure, the protocol, et cetera, it's all online. Like you can find it all very easily on our website. And we do that on purpose because we're aware that we're working with a product that's a molecule that's not patented. MDMA is off patent. And we're very much like in this arc of trying to make sure that like whatever we can do to maximize human good is being put first before the profit. Now, well, I'm curious about how our values hold up in what will really rapidly be a multi-billion-dollar industry. I like to joke that like MAPS went from being kind of like a scrappy drug policy nonprofit to being the leader of an emerging biotech industry within 2 years, and that's kind of like where we're at now.
Well, are there kind of sister organizations to MAPS in the nonprofit landscape, or are there also for-profit organizations that are dedicated to the legalization of psychedelics and entheogens?
That's I wish I had a better answer for you. The short answer is that there is one other very well-known nonprofit that's been doing similar drug development work with psilocybin called USONA, working through the Hefter Institute, and they've been doing nonprofit drug development work with psilocybin and putting out their formulation. They do really amazing work with psilocybin, and have been working on a similar timeline as MAPS now for over 20 years or longer. However, that organization has historically not been as active in the conversation about legalization or decriminalization as, for example, MAPS has. MAPS founder Rick Doblin he's a lot of things, but he's definitely an activist as part of his work. So we've always had like a very strong political analysis and an engagement in the political system, because for us, science and politics are not separated. As much as we want to believe, like we like to say that science over politics, but as someone who's been working in drug policy for quite some time, it's very clear that evidence alone does not form policy. Like, it'd be nice if we just use the facts to inform policy, but it's also a lot of ideology, it's a lot of hysteria, it's a lot of other things. So it's actually kind of a huge benefit that we can work in a nonprofit context, because we can be more of an activist. We can push back against FDA. We actually we negotiate with FDA. We don't just, we actually push back on the things that they ask for. We actually are filing a lawsuit today to sue the Department of Justice, which is something that a lot of a lot of drug development companies might not do, because we're basically, filing a lawsuit against an organization that we have to get we have to work with. But we're doing it because on principle, the way that the Department of Justice is operated with respect to a particular issue is simply wrong. So we're in a position where we can be more political than most groups. And as of now, I have not yet seen a for-profit company come out as strongly in favor of decriminalization or legalization, except for a few potentially in places like Oregon or others where there's actually a chance for a company to actually like participate in an emerging industry. So I think in the same way that you saw for-profit cannabis businesses get more involved in cannabis legalization efforts over the course of the last 15 years, slowly but surely. And, you saw some big cannabis companies, Harborside is Berkeley Patients Group are both good examples of where they were like, prosecuted by the federal government and, created kind of a big activist movement around them. For the most part, I think that we're early on. Like I haven't really seen big for-profit companies show up at all in the psychedelic space that in a political way. Like they're really focusing on this like drug development kind of clinical research area, which is great. And also I think that one of my worries is that we end up with a bunch of people who are really excited to make a bunch of money and maybe don't actually look at some of the lingering kind of policy issues that really need to be handled at a mass scale for psychedelics to be responsibly integrated into the culture.
Well, I'm really glad you brought up politics with this discussion. And I wanted to ask you, are there ideological opponents, right, to medicalization of psychedelics that you at MAPS have had to sort of banter with? Like one thing that really is interesting to me, all the progress that you've made over the last 4 years. And I guess I just don't understand why the Trump administration has been relatively lax, or the FDA under the Trump administration has been relatively open to the work that you're doing. Because if I had to guess, I'd think that this kind of usage would fall into the rubric of war on drugs. And traditionally they've sort of like hammered that. Yeah. Can you speak to that for a second?
Absolutely. Yeah. So you raised a couple things in this question that I really appreciate, and I'll speak to them kind of relatedly, but there are also kind of multiple pieces to it. So first off, starting with your last point around like, the Trump FDA and all those pieces, one of the reasons I think, our founder, Rick, has pursued this particular strategy is because there has been like this story within kind of the American institution that bodies like the FDA are supposed to be separate from politics. They're not supposed to be bound by politics. They're supposed to be bound by evidence and facts. And I would say that's more true of FDA than, for example, an institution like DEA, which is continuing to really like, hammer down. However, because our drug policy is just so ridiculous and has been kind of so slow to change, we're now in a position where DEA actually, on this specific issue that I was talking about earlier with respect to our lawsuit, it's interesting because in that particular situation, cannabis and policy around cannabis is way more complex in the US than policy around MDMA, policy around other psychedelics. I'm not totally sure why. There's a lot of theories behind it. I mean, it's possible that people just are less familiar with it. When people hear the word psilocybin, they're like, what the heck is that? But I feel like there's this awareness that I should rephrase that. Like cannabis has come with so much political baggage that like people, and it's still being fought, right? Like the MORE Act might get voted on by the House like next week or in a couple of weeks or something to federally legalize cannabis, which is a huge deal. There's a big conversation at the federal level, but it's taken a very, very long time to get here. And I actually have noticed that with respect to other psychedelics and other medicines, MDMA, psilocybin, others, there's been a lot less stigma and a lot less of the kind of like political baggage. One other thing I'll add to that might be relevant is that our approach, MAPS's approach, and the approach of, I would say, the kind of field more broadly, has really focused on a solution-oriented approach. So basically, in the year of our Lord 2020, like we have so much pain, so much suffering, like we have so much addiction, we have so much, and like these are all issues that like people, families have been dealing with for a very long time in a lot of different contexts. Marginalized people for a very long time in a lot of different contexts. And now because of kind of the visibility of the opioid epidemic, the visibility of suicide, the visibility of all of these kind of mental health disorders that, in this last year have really been exacerbated by COVID, we actually don't have to do, and one of the most interesting things I find is that I don't have to do as much persuasion as I thought I would have to do starting this job. A lot of what I do is education. And most people come to the conclusion on their own. Like, hey, there's this thing that was treated a certain way for a very long time by the political establishment. They were wrong. They had incorrect information. We've now done a lot of research to show that it's wrong. And in fact, there might be some benefits. And it just so happens that those benefits respond to like the top 3 most relevant mental health needs today, trauma, addiction, depression, anxiety. So like those, I think that like it's kind of a timing thing where I think that the research has really crystallized at the point that society is also realizing that there's this huge need and that Western pharmaceutical, palliative day by day medicating is just not working or it's not effective. So like, for example, I'll just give a couple anecdotes. Like, I work fairly closely with people who work with veterans and with other kind of impacted populations like that. And it's very interesting because I'm not someone who like I would not have thought 5 years ago that I would even be interested or have the capacity to be talking to Veterans Affairs staffers for Republicans in DC, right? That's like not something that I like would have even thought we could have tried to convince, but partially because of the strategy that Rick and Maps has pursued, really focusing on, for sure, veterans, for sure, first responders, but also kind of, like I said, the solution-oriented response where being like, well, there's a lot of need. How can we support that need? It's actually been a lot easier than expected. I mean, the reality is that it works. Like, I don't mean like MDMA works for this or cannabis works for that. What I mean is that a lot of people have really found relief through their own, sometimes illegal, sometimes people have like put themselves at risk to experience some level of healing or relief. And although we are not out here trying to make claims at this point about what this drug can or can't do, the fact is that people are finding these things. And what we're just trying to do is build like the legal and the scientific basis to justify what's just observably real and what's happening. So I'll say one last thing, which is that like the most persuasive thing I think I can do for, conversations that do get tough, it's rare that we have straight up opposition because usually it's much more political and much more. And I don't want to say that it's like easy because like the opposition is really a systemic thing. Like the DEA as an institution, like a lot of these organizations as institutions, their National Institute of Drug Abuse, like their whole thing, their whole shtick is about like finding the bad things about drugs or finding ways to control them. And if that's what your job is, you're going to keep finding ways to do that. But like that, like the justification for that is really starting to kind of dissolve. Mm-hmm. And one of the most persuasive things I've found when I work, especially with people on the right or Republicans or people who are more skeptical, which it really isn't just people on the right, it's people of like all over who have concerns about drugs or drug use, is that psychedelic therapy isn't really fun. That's the thing. I think that there's this really big kind of moral perspective that anything that brings pleasure to a drug user is bad. You can totally unpack that more later, but regardless of whether or not it's okay for people to be experiencing pleasure or not when they're using drugs, most people who are going through psychedelic therapy experiences to work on their trauma are not actually enjoying it per se. It's actually a hard healing process that requires deep reflection, deep holding, a lot of safety, integration time, preparation. Like it's not like, and I guess that's the thing. It's like, it is absolutely true that people experience healing in more kind of hedonistic or celebratory environments for sure. But for the therapy modality itself, like it's usually really hard. And when people are like, oh, wait, people are like willingly facing their worst traumas and processing them, like it's a different frame, right? It's not like, oh, they're just getting high, so they're feeling better. It's like, no, they're doing work. They're actually doing work with this substance with their therapist or whatever. And that is, so it's really like a reframing. And once it's reframed, people are very rarely in opposition. Maybe the rest is the details. Like, how do we legalize it? What's the commercial fee? All the other stuff.
Well, I guess this is worth a point of clarification. Is MAPS's strategy, it's not just simply legalization of MDMA or legalization of psilocybin. It is a medicalization. It is a legalization of the substance under therapy.
Well, yes and no, in the sense that yes, because that is the main focus of our primary strategy at this time is to legalize under a medicalized framework. But we actually we do go beyond that. We actually do believe that first off, all drugs, every single drug, all of them, yes, even the scary ones, should be fully decriminalized. We think that any sort of criminal penalties for the use or possession of drugs is just unethical for a number of reasons that we can kind of break down if desired. And further, where we would support like legal regulated access to drugs. What that looks like varies a lot depending on the country and the drug and the context. And there's this concept which we've been really reflecting on a lot called safe supply. It's a concept that really has emerged in Canada and Europe especially, where 20 or 30 years ago in Switzerland, they started providing like pure, unadulterated heroin to people who are addicted to heroin in Switzerland. And it's been really successful because when you don't have to resort to crime or you're not dealing with weird adulterants in your thing, you don't really have overdoses, you don't have people turning to crime to get their drug. I mean, if you could get heroin as easily as people get coffee at Starbucks, again, I'm not saying that we should create a Starbucks of heroin either, but if we criminalize caffeine tomorrow, there'd be a lot of people turning to crime to get their fix. You know what I mean? So the idea is like that the legal environment in which something happens really affects people's use pattern. And although we're not saying that we should sell every drug at the gas station, the idea of having some sort of legal regulated supply for a drug in medicine or outside of it, depending on the substance in various contexts, may actually be better for public health. And I think this kind of election in Oregon that decriminalized drugs is a really big first step, because it'll show, can we do what Portugal did 15 years ago? Portugal fully decriminalized drug and replaced it with the treatment model. It's been wildly successful, definitely has its limitations, but has a lot of benefits. And now we'll know, like in 2 years, 4 years, can the US do that? Can we start with that? And then from that point forward, like, then what? And that kind of goes to your point, where it's just like, well, what is it that we're trying to argue for? And it's really like a drug policy that is grounded in human rights and compassion, and an environment where people can utilize the benefits of psychedelics to their maximum potential, which requires safety and harm reduction and training and education and all of this stuff. And also a society that's not going to like throw you in jail if you, for whatever reason, get caught out, doing something. So
I love your strategy and your outlook of your organization. It seems almost, it's so idealistic in a certain sense. I mean, you're more idealistic than I am, because I've seen so much harm inflicted upon the population of the United States under the name of the war on drugs. I wonder if this question is too broad, you can tell me, but if it's applicable to our conversation, maybe it would be useful to talk a little bit about the history of the war on drugs and how it sort of affects what you're up against in the mission of what you do at MAPS.
Yeah, I would be glad to. And I'll give you a short version of this, but the story is 500 years long. And people usually start the story of the war on drugs with Nixon and with the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. And maybe, we know that there was the push in the 60s to criminalize heroin and Black people and hippies and the anti-war movement. We know that there was a move in the 30s to criminalize cannabis, really, really motivated by anti-immigrant sentiment and a lot of the conflict that was happening at the US-Mexico border at the time. We know that there was a push to criminalize opium in the late 1800s, especially on the West Coast, when we had all these Chinese immigrants coming in to work on the railroads and so on. So there's like this, a lot of people are semi-familiar with like the racialized history of drug prohibition over the last at least 100 years. And those are kind of significant milestones. And, what you were talking about, what we know today as like the modern war on drugs over the last 50 years or so, is kind of how many people have thought about it. But to your point, like I just want to bring up this, in my perspective, in my telling of history and understanding of history, the war or this battle for consciousness that really is articulated through how we think about drugs and substances, I think started 500 years ago. I think it started upon the colonization of what we call the New World. And, many people are semi-familiar, some with, different levels of accuracy than others, about how like the Americas were colonized and how culture was what was the kind of the modern Western culture was kind of emerged out of that, which involved genocide, it involved slavery, it involved like a number of extremely exploitative systems. One of the things that's sometimes lost is the amount of what people call cultural genocide that occurred, which is not just the killing of people, but it's also the eradication of concepts and culture, its history and society and so on. And a lot of there's good evidence that one of the main things that settlers did in the early kind of days of what they call the New World is actually eradicate these like spiritual practices of the native people. So a lot of the art, although this is harder to say for something like LSD or MDMA, both of which are drugs which are more or less invented in the last 100 years. For a lot of other substances, including psilocybin and DMT and others that kind of fall into this category of psychedelics, there is, a very, very, very long global historical use of these things, and the eradication of those practices far preceded the modern war on drugs, such that the perception of these alternative practices that weren't Christianity or weren't whatever were seen as being demonized or seen as being dangerous, literally hundreds of years ago. So I say that because when we think about the big arc of what we're trying to do, I'm actually say maybe one more thing, which is that like up until the late 1800s, most of the global drug trade did exist under the arm of like large economic systems. So like the British government or the Dutch government or whoever, like there's a big history around how opium made it back to China through the British. And, there's a lot of history around how trade around these drugs actually occurred. And this idea of prohibition, of criminalizing drugs, was actually an American idea that started about 100 and something years ago. It's not, if you look, most of history, drugs were not prohibited. They were criminalized in certain ways or traded by certain people who had power. So the idea of like this full blanket prohibition on drugs that then led to, formulated here in the United States and then kind of pushed out to the UN and became kind of like the global drug control mechanism over the last 100 years, is actually an exception to the rule. So the way I think about it and the way that we think about our advocacy work is actually now that we're trying to change something to something, we are trying to change to something new, but we're actually coming back to something that we've been doing for a long time, both thinking about how psychedelic medicine gets held in ceremony, as well as trying to create a system where we're actually like honestly and truthfully talking about the benefits and the harms in a realistic way. Like the idea here is not to overly glamorize or overly commercialize, right? And I think that's the rub. It's like, we're not just trying to legalize it to sell it. Like there's like benefits, and of course things are going to open enter the market, like you were saying, and so on earlier. But actually, like this idea of trying to bring drug policy back to the way things have been, where like we have trade, where we have like honest conversations about it, and we can honestly discuss like the risks that really do exist, instead of kind of like putting them in this like untouchable category. Like I don't know if you I was part of the DARE generation, so like I got the like just say no, like big doobies with like stoned eyes. That whole arc is new. It's an exception to the rule. It's not how most of history has been. So I think like bringing this all back to kind of your question, like, well, what's this big storyline? It's partially to destigmatize the drugs themselves, but at its core level, it's so much more about ethical and humane treatment of the people who use the drugs. Because if we zoom back up to this more modern history with how the drug control system has been used to target certain social populations, certain demographic populations, where it's about the drugs, but it's really about the people who use the drugs. So like our whole arc around drug policy is like, how do we make it a more compassionate, less stigmatized, safer, more healthful, more whole world where people who are using drugs are not totally separated from any sort of real services that are trying to help them. And at the same time, like people who are seeking support can actually get that without having to go through the shame of having like failed, this whole like moral story around drugs and drug uses, I think cause a lot of harm. And it's made it really hard for people to get help. So it's made it really hard for us to have like real adult conversations about drugs, because we're so like in this like storyline that the war on drugs kind of created for us. So I don't know if that answers your question, but thinking about like this long arc really helps crystallize the purpose, like what the outcome is. And like so much of it is figuring out what worked in the past that we can bring back, and thinking about like what concerns or issues are up in today's paradigm that can be responded to by, a responsible, mindful, intentional use of these substances.
There's so much there with the war on drugs, so much there. Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you brought up DARE. I guess I'm DARE generation, or McGruff, the crime dog generation. Nice, yeah. That I McGruff, yeah. Even as a second or third grader, I remember how ineffectual the propaganda was. It made me want to try drugs, actually, because I distrusted it.
Most of us.
The thing I wanted to bring up from the 1980s, since I took a whack at the Trump administration in previous question, was Biden, actually. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was the sponsor of a really injurious bill, part of the R.A.V.E. Act, which created severe penalties for MDMA use. And I was hoping you could walk me through that, as well as kind of talk about, do you have any trepidation around the political landscape with a Biden administration?
Yeah, super good question. And probably the most existential conflict that fellow drug war kind of healers, especially those of us that are more on the political left, are dealing with right now. So that's a really good question. And Biden didn't just sponsor the R.A.V.E. Act. He also was the primary author for the crime bill of 1994. And a lot of today's drug policy was really pushed by this like law and order Democrat of the early 90s. And Biden is like the best example of that kind of archetype. This is also when like Bill Clinton and really the Democratic Party as a whole was trying to kind of catch up to the Republicans with their tough on crime rhetoric. Like Republicans really nailed that in the 80s. So you had kind of the, like, not, I wouldn't say the left, but the Democrats like starting to kind of like try to match them at that. And that's where I think you see this like kind of pendulum swing, which is these policies. So yeah, I'll say two things. One, on the R.A.V.E. Act, it's interesting because the R.A.V.E. Act is an extension of crack house statutes, which basically create liability for landlords or landowners, managers that allow drug use to occur on their property. And there's a broad explanation of that. About a year or two ago, I'm not actually sure now, probably about 2 years ago, the Department of Justice did issue a memo saying that it would not be prosecuting people who were implementing harm reduction through the R.A.V.E. Act, which is a big deal because one of the big concerns was that promoters could be held liable for knowing that there's drug use on the property just by allowing harm reduction to happen there. So like, I mean, in basics, like free water, earplugs, like a chill space for people to sit if they're too stimulated. Like those are all basic harm reduction measures that we really want to see at any event where people may or may not be doing drugs. And there was a big worry for a very long time that venue owners who wanted to implement harm reduction would not be able to because they'd be perceiving this thing. As far as I know, there's only been one case in which that prosecution has actually happened. It was some years ago. And since the DOJ has now said pretty explicitly, like, that's not the intent of this, we can kind of breathe a little sigh of relief there. But that then leads to like kind of a bigger question, which is like, is this environment, this political environment, going to be one where we can undo, frankly, a lot of the things that kind of like the Biden Democrats and like the kind of like that whole early 90s criminal reform era really created? And just as a note to that, like I was born and raised in Fresno, California, which I found out only a couple of years ago was the birthplace of this 3 strikes law. Like the 3 strikes law, which put a lot of people in jail for a very long time, really, really damaging, I think, as a whole for our whole political system. And of course, for the lives of so many people who had to deal with that criminal legal system. You know, I really see like what's like the criminal justice arc broadly now. It's so interesting to see like what the last 20 years of criminal justice have looked like, because today, I'm sure you see people like the Koch brothers or like other generally Republican leaning or right leaning people who are suddenly like, wait a minute, this criminal justice problem is a real issue and we need to figure out what to do about it. We're spending too much money. We're not getting the outcomes we want. I think that the rhetoric of the early 90s has really hit its expiration point, in the sense that like we now can see 20 years later, 30 years later, that a lot of the attempts to incarcerate our way, as they say, arrest or incarcerate our way out of crime just doesn't work. So going more specifically to your question, I'm very curious, and actually I'll also just name Kamala Harris, because she also, she was a very, very effective prosecutor, as a California AG. And did some really amazing things with respect to corporate issues and human trafficking, and also like just perpetuated kind of like the drug control system as it is as well. So the fact that we're getting to, yes, Democrats, but also like real drug warriors, like people who are like at the forefront of the war on drugs, like, and not on our side for a long time, is a very interesting paradigm. And at the beginning of the Trump administration, there was a conversation we had internally at MAPS around, well, what if one of the things that Trump does and his administration does is deregulate the FDA? Because, there's a big move, especially like the libertarian right kind of U.S. political movement, to deregulate in general, reduce regulations for things. And we were like, well, what happens if, they deregulate FDA and it becomes easier to put drugs through? Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a good thing for MDMA. What if we did that? One of the concerns that I brought up at that time, and I'm really glad that, now 4 years later, we were able to navigate this really responsibly, I think, was like, well, what happens when in 4 years or in 8 years, at the time, whatever, and the pendulum swings back, people are like, well, all these things that got passed through FDA when it was deregulated, how do we know that they're up to the same standards that every other drug has been? Right. And that's a real concern, for us and also for like science broadly. So I think just broadly speaking, like the way that we create these narratives, we push some of these narratives, like really has an impact on the outcome. And I'm really glad we actually ended up first off, the FDA didn't get very deregulated over the last 4 years, and for the most part. And we continued out, from MAPS' part, our process of making sure that we were holding things to the highest of standard. We were over-reporting, putting more information than we need, really going above and beyond to avoid any concern about that. But with respect to Biden and Harris, I think that a big question for us is going to be, well, for one, how much have they changed? How much have Biden and Harris and also their policies and their internal policy perspectives changed over the last, 20 years or 10 years or however long. Joe Biden did say in multiple debates that no person should be arrested for using drugs or go to jail for using drugs. That's a huge shift from Joe Biden in 1994. So if he really means that, and that's a meaningful shift, then we could see, and again, that plus this other move from the right and this bipartisan move toward decarceration and reducing criminal penalties broadly and kind of shifting the paradigm is encouraging. But I really think it's going to depend on, advocates that are coming to the left of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris to push them further on criminal justice. And, if they get help from libertarians or people on the right for that, then great. It's hard to say that I would definitely not say that I'm more worried now than I was during the Trump administration, just because there were so many other implications, although, we're not out of the woods at all yet. And I'm curious to see if Harris and Biden lean into that narrative as part of their policy, or if they think otherwise. I will say one quick thing, which is that Hunter Biden has been in the news and is known for his struggles with addiction. There's a really good interview where he's been interviewed with someone a couple of weeks ago, and they're like, "You were in and out of rehab." And he's like, "Whoa, wait, say it nicer. I sought treatment millions of Americans." So I think that there's a general move toward destigmatizing drugs and drug use in general, which I think will be good for this. Whether or not that also translates into openness to changing policy around psychedelics and medicalization, I think is a slightly different question. But the good news is that because we operate in the realm of science, not politics, it kind of doesn't matter what the administration thinks, because we're working with the FDA on this thing that's supposed to be buffered from that political pressure. And although, I would have been skeptical about this 4 years ago, the fact that the FDA has been able to stay quite independent of political pressure over the course of the last 4 years does bode well for us in the future. Where I don't really anticipate there being a huge, to your earlier question too, a huge pushback where suddenly we're worried that there's a drug warrior in the White House and they're resistant to us doing our very, very careful, highly regulated medical research. That's less of a concern. I think the bigger question is will we be able to, independently of the psychedelics, will we be able to enact the very large criminal justice reforms that people want? Reimagining policing, thinking of alternatives to armed response, thinking about crisis response, thinking about diversion from prison. There's a lot of other big criminal justice kind of efforts that are moving forward, bail reform, that I think those are the questions that I have for this next administration. On the psychedelic stuff, I feel confident that our narrative and our long-standing now, I say multi-partisan instead of bipartisan, because we work with people from all these different kind of places, but our multi-partisan kind of strategy buffers us a bit from the pendulum back and forth.
And talk to me for a moment about insurance. Talk to me about FDA approval and why it's so key in terms of insurance to the aim of bringing psychedelic therapy to a broad base of people.
Yeah, super love this question. You're asking, I appreciate your question so much. I appreciate that you've thought about this, and these are all, it's a good flow too, because it's hard sometimes to just jump into some of these questions without having some of that context. So I just want to appreciate, the way that you framed this.
Absolutely. Also, Ismail just referenced a couple of interviews that I listened to before this that I'm conducting. One was with Laura May Northrup and yourself. The interview that she created brought a lot of these questions to my mind. So a lot of respect to Laura for what she's
Awesome. I appreciate Laura very much. And I know that she's finishing up a book right now, so putting out good energy for that. Yeah, so to your question about insurance. So two things. One, generally speaking, drugs get covered by insurance both after they're approved by FDA and there's some sort of effort on the part of the manufacturer to show an insurance company that it's worth getting covered. I also want to differentiate here insurance in the United States versus insurance in other parts of the world, including parts of the world that have figured out that universal healthcare is a better system. So in the US, to get insurance coverage, you basically have to get FDA approval, and then there has to be a process where you're proving to each of these insurance companies that this particular drug is worth getting paid or worth getting covered. So at first, a lot of that work is done by FDA approval. It's pretty much, and I don't know this for sure, but as far as I know, there are very few, I won't say none, but no to very few interventions that are covered by insurance that are not FDA approved. So generally speaking, FDA approval is one of the big triggers for that. in the US, where we live in a payment for healthcare model, the only way to get access to both the medication and a modality like MDMA therapy or psychedelic therapy, which requires hours of professional care in addition to the drug itself, is if someone is paying for it, if there's some sort of like payer that's able to cover it. And in a best case scenario, broadly speaking, a best case scenario, the patient themselves may, in my opinion, should not be covering it at all. Like, I think there's lots of ways to think about coverage, but in the US, like we have to get FDA approval for MDMA to be covered by insurance and thus available as a treatment for people who aren't able to afford it otherwise. The modality itself, just really quickly, is a little bit different from traditional therapy in the sense that a lot of, and most pharmaceutical or psychiatric medication, most psychiatric medication is palliative in the sense that it's being taken every day for an indefinite amount of time. And that's not always true. People sometimes take antidepressants on year-long cycles or so on, but very often a lot of the pharmaceutical interventions are palliative. They're long-term. Similarly, most non-medical interventions, like let's say psychotherapy, which you don't need a diagnosis to receive, are billed in a certain way. You get like a 50-hour block, and like that's how you get billed, and your insurance will cover it in this context, and da-da-da-da. MDMA therapy is a bit complex because it combines those things. So it has a lot of hours of therapy, and it has a drug that actually only gets taken like a handful of times, maybe 2, maybe 3. So it's actually more helpful to think about MDMA therapy as surgery as opposed to a psychiatric medication, because it's more like an intervention. It's a short-term thing that has a prep, during, after, that has a high cost, but it's a short amount of time and it has long-term health benefits, as opposed to a drug which maybe you only pay 70 cents a day per pill or whatever, but then that adds up over a lifetime. So it's a different approach to kind of the care in general. And we're going to have to go through, we're in the process now where we're going to have to go through a pretty intensive negotiation process with insurance companies to make sure that they understand that MDMA therapy is actually more cost effective for them than giving someone an SSRI for 35 years. We're doing some of that analysis now, and it's, that's really critical here because insurance companies are also figuring out what their margins are and so on. So if we want to make sure that it's as cheap as possible for the actual patient, we need to convince the insurance companies that it's worth them paying for. The other point I want to make is that we're also working simultaneously in Europe. And that's different because in Canada, in places where you have kind of a universal or single payer healthcare system, in a place like Europe, it's really interesting because the state itself usually pays for healthcare through the state-run insurance program. It's less needed. The main thing, of course, you have to show efficacy and safety. That's like always the case. But in Europe, like if we're able to show that it's more cost effective than other drugs, which we're fairly certain we're going to be able to show and are already starting to develop some of the data for that, the state just covers it. Like it ends up, and the idea is that it ends up saving these payers a lot of money. Like the VA, I don't have the numbers on me right now, but the VA spends millions of dollars per person, right? Per person over the course of their lifetime for their long-term therapy, care, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that having some sort of like payment approach in a place like Europe, where like people at the point of service, like don't actually need to be putting the money down, is probably like the best way for, what I would say is like kind of mass access. Like this also kind of bleeds into a question around like just financial access and like what something like this will cost. Because, our protocol is like, I think it's like 48 or 52 hours of therapy. Even if you look at like the cheapest like Medi-Cal reimbursement numbers, we're talking like thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars of therapy time, just for therapy time, not even including the drug, which will actually probably be the cheapest part. Figuring out how to make sure that there are as many payers as possible that are able, willing, and have the capacity to pay this and want to pay this is another big thing. And I would say that like this, we were talking about this earlier, this question about commercialization and how we bring things to the market. I on a personal level, really strongly believe that if we were able to move to some sort of either universal or like more universal healthcare system, would be better for more people. So we're kind of like figuring out how do we make this modality work within the current system, which has a lot of like pitfalls. And I think that I feel confident, after the Affordable Care Act, there's a larger number of Americans that are covered by insurance. If we can get Medi-Cal or one of these like major insurance or the VA to provide care through this way, like, we'd be making a really big dent in this. And I think our big question is going to be, can we show that it saves money? And I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. I mean, doing an intervention that takes literally like 2 to 3 weeks or months, and then has like the kind of, outcomes that we have is just it just improves people's quality of life so much. It allows them to work, to do things that they're otherwise losing when they're in this highly dilapidated state. Yeah, the insurance question is a big one, though. It's one that I think about a lot. And I think it keeps some of us up because we're just like, we're really excited about this modality, but if it ends up costing, thousands and thousands of dollars, like who's going to be able to do it unless we can convince these companies that it's good for everyone, including them.
The objective of this show that we're creating at Esalen, this set of interviews, is to find out what's happening in psychedelics today, but particularly from a social justice lens as well. And I've noticed MAPS being a thought leader in this space, as well as Chacruna.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for that. Thank you so much for that.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you, why do you think there's this kind of focus and this kind of curiosity to this issue by the players in the field of psychedelics? As psychedelics historically has a typically kind of white male vibe to it. When I think about the big names, it's like Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey and Myron Stolaroff. I notice it's kind of changing. And I wonder if you could just speak to that, please.
Yeah, this is my favorite topic. One of my favorite topics. So just to start, on a personal level, like my personal answer. So I was born in California in Fresno, but my father's family was born and raised in India. He was born in India and raised in Pakistan, and my mother's family is from Colombia. Personally, have like my whole personal story around like how I engage with these substances and the culture around them and so on has been really informed by like my own understanding of how we think about ancestry, how we think about history and all of these things. And I say that because, thinking really big picture around like what it means that the kind of like respectful use of a lot of these substances in places like India, like Africa, like the Central and South America, like they're like the fact that there was such an attempt to eradicate and kind of repress these beliefs is a signal to me of like what they were seeing, how powerful they were seeing this being. And like, even if you look at it purely from a cultural sense, like the way that peyote or ayahuasca or other substances have been used to build cultural cohesion within traditions, tribal traditions, and so on, really does show. And you see it again today, it's really kind of starting to show up, like how these substances can really empower people and empower cultures and empower groups when they're done in integrity. So I think that on a really big scale, there's kind of a reclaiming that's happening, and like this angle around like social justice language and so on, like how we think about, people from the global diaspora or people of color, however you want to call them, us, however you want to like kind of name these different kind of cultures and traditions. A lot of it, I think, especially right now, 2020 these days, is really focused on this idea of reclaiming and being like, well, what would these traditions have looked like if there wasn't an attempt to eradicate them by the Catholic Church, for example, or by the Spanish government or by the British government or all these different entities over the course of and then later by the United States itself over the course of the last 250 years. There's this meta arc that's like, whoa, these substances are actually, they come from like, these various global traditions. And there are people from those traditions in diaspora generations later all over the world. And there's a lot of us here in the US and we're like, what? Like this is like, and so there's this aspect of like intergenerational reclaiming that's really happening, which is super beautiful to see. And then that's like one kind of really existential kind of like core value-based kind of way to look at it. And then there's also this question that we were just talking about around, practically speaking, access. So there's a spectrum of like how trauma has impacted society, and trauma has impacted certain demographics more than others. And we have good evidence that people who are experiencing racialized trauma, who are experiencing gender-based violence, who are experiencing all these things, these different kind of issues, are highly impacted by trauma. And when you have people or cultures who have been impacted by similar trauma over multiple generations, we're in a position where we live in a highly traumatized society, highly traumatized society. And the idea that psychedelics, and this kind of like loops into what we were talking about cannabis, like the idea that psychedelics could suddenly be legal and available and we can pay for them and they can help us with their things, like that's really exciting. And it kind of freaks people out when they're like, wait a minute, we saw what happened with cannabis. We saw the millions of people that were arrested and incarcerated. We see now, John Boehner on the board of Canopy Holdings, like we see the amount of money that's going to be made in this industry without having taken care of its harms. And I think that is, even from like a karmic perspective, very risky. People are making a lot of money off of something that's off of a system that's caused a lot of harm to people. So I think very practically speaking, there's a worry that psychedelics, even if they become available, to your point earlier, they become available for rich people who can afford them, whatever, like people who've been highly traumatized, people of color, women, people who've survived sexual trauma or childhood abuse, refugees, like they're not, there's usually a correlation. Like there's usually some correlation between, the extremity of someone's trauma and their ability to like survive in the world. Like generally highly traumatized people have a tougher time getting jobs. They're usually more socioeconomically marginalized. So these things are all, kind of compound on each other. So the idea that we could have legal access to super expensive psychedelics that only rich people will get access to, while like the, descendants of the people whose practices were eradicated would not have access to it, both financially speaking and also culturally, because there's no cultural competence from the therapist or the practitioners to actually offer it. Like that feels like an injustice. So I think that what you're talking about, this idea of bringing kind of a justice-oriented lens to psychedelics has much to do with the awareness of what their potential actually is, much to do with an awareness of how intergenerational trauma works and is held. And one of the related arcs that's happening that I think is very tied to this is the difference between individualized, like 2-on-1 or 1-on-1 therapy, and group therapy or communal healing. And I think like what's going to happen as psychedelics become less stigmatized and become more normal right now, when there's like this very strict, like individualized healthcare paradigm, I think that that's going to change. And, if you look at naturalistic use of psychedelics, how people are actually doing it, it's often in groups. It's more often than not, it's in groups, even if it's small groups of friends taking a hike in the forest, or people at a festival, or in a circle, very well held indigenous ceremony. So all that to say that like this arc toward kind of social justice to me is a part of bringing out the core ethos of what these medicines and these substances and these structures are meant to offer in the first place. It's actually a symptom of kind of American exceptionalism, American assimilation, that the way that you and I, the way that we were taught to originally think about psychedelics. So this is me too. I was also introduced to psychedelics through people like Ken Kesey and reading those books and stuff. Like even as someone who now I can see my own history and recognize, but as a teenager, I was like arrowwood.com, I was like, that's where I learned this stuff too. So I think that there's kind of a meeting here, kind of a meeting of concepts here where like, oh, there's this reclamation. There's a way that these are actually the people's medicine. A lot of these plants are the people's medicine. They're really like cultural modalities that have also like, developed these like traditions or so on. And at the same time, there's like the very real need for trauma healing and just from a very like practical perspective. And this has to do with, different people have different theories of change around this, but it's very much like the rising tide lifts all boats kind of vibe. Like if we can make MDMA therapy such a stigmatized, or psychedelic therapy, such a stigmatized substance and a very like weird out there esoteric alternative practice, like if these things can become available to the most marginalized people, it only follows that everyone else will also be able to have access to it. Like it's really, and so it's also like a theory of change where we're like, how do we ensure that these most marginalized people are protected and have a context that's actually effective and works for them, while also making it palatable enough to the rest of the society. Like I wonder sometimes, because we're talking a lot about, like race and POC and like how we think about all these concepts. And sometimes I wonder, like, if it wasn't, mostly white privileged people who were doing this research in the 90s and early 2000s, would it have continued? I don't know. Like I really, honestly, and I say this to, my colleagues, like I appreciate that there are people who've been willing to put themselves in legal risk, because like 10 years ago, I would not have imagined it would be possible for me to be someone doing it. The fact that like I'm able to be public about my experiences with psychedelics or my work or whatever, like that all is possible because there are a lot of people with more privilege who are willing to show up and be like, well, we're actually going to say this and we'll put ourselves at risk to do that. And of course, it's complicated because like at some point there's also going to be a reckoning for like who, it's like you said, like who represents these things, whose authority is it, who do we have to listen to? Those are bigger questions that I don't think we can answer to by just looking at history. I think that that's going to be a much more like existential question for the psychedelic movement, or for the movement of people that are seeking to create access to these things. I have a tough time defining a movement by what we consume alone. There's usually more than that. The language that we're using at APP is health equity. Like in the same way that, with cannabis, there's all these people in jail, like it would have been really right and a really respect groups like the Last Prisoner Project and others that are really fighting to make sure that as long as people are making money off of cannabis in the legal market, we got to get people out of jail. We cannot keep incarcerating people for the same behavior. It's just not fair. It's just not right. So similarly, our approach, because there isn't the same volume of people incarcerated currently for psychedelics as there are for something like cannabis or heroin or cocaine, the way that we're approaching is, well, how do we incorporate health equity into this outcome? And this goes back to the first part of this conversation that we were having around like, well, how do you bring something to the market in an ethical way? And so much of that for us is like, well, who has access to the benefit of whatever that is, whether it's the economic benefit of starting the business or the actual health benefit of the outcome. Because we're actually about to announce, we're close to announcing, I can definitely talk about it here, a health equity program. It's going to be a multi-million-dollar effort that really shifts a lot of our a lot of the big projects that we're working on to create access to MDMA. So insurance is one of them. Who we train, who's actually trained to offer it, like are they culturally competent? Can they work with different populations and so on? We're putting a lot of energy over the next couple of years in the years leading up to approval, specifically to make sure that we have, I think that the framing we've been using is trying to make it so the therapists that we have trained reflect the demographics of the United States, which is harder than it sounds because most people who are in, or many therapists or people who are in this position, it tends to kind of lean white, lean Caucasian. So we're trying to figure out like, how do we make sure that there's like some sort of like balance here and representation, not just like cynical representation. Oh, we just have the right, skin color person in the right place. But like, how do we actually make sure that the care is competent and that people can have? So we're thinking about, we have about 2 years, a year and a half or 2 years before, anticipated FDA approval. And we're like, what are all of the things that we can do to make sure health equity is folded in? And I'm very excited. I feel like, there'll be more announcement about it, at the beginning of 2021. And I'm really curious, like legitimately, like as someone who's working within apps, like, can we do it? Like, is it possible to work within this like larger system while also prioritizing equity in a way that has a meaningful impact?
Well, we're coming towards the end of our time, and you've been so generous with your time. I want to ask you kind of a large question to conclude with. Do you share with what Michael Pollan has kind of called an evangelical enthusiasm for psychedelics? So in other words, we're talking about this equity for all people. Are there moments when you believe in the capacity of psychedelics itself, the substance, and I guess the container in which it's delivered, including the therapy, to bestow this knowledge of unity, oneness, connectedness that might affect views and policy on, say, equity, racism, or even environmentalism?
Yeah, I love this question because it's more of a dilemma or a discussion than even a question or a problem to be solved. You know what I mean? Like, because it brings up so much. But I'll start by saying that I don't personally believe that psychedelic substances have an inherent like moral value. And one of the things that kind of holds our commitment to decriminalizing all drugs is this idea that separating good drugs and bad drugs actually increases stigma on people who are using different substances. And I'm very careful about how I frame those things because like I've seen a tremendous amount of harm occur to people and families and communities because of drugs. And I've also seen a lot of benefits. And I'm not just talking about psychedelics. I'm just talking about drugs in general. So I also, because I've seen so much harm and so many things occur to people, whether it's self-inflicted or inflicted by the state or something else, like I'm very cautious about basically why and how I'm talking about these substances and for which purpose. So the nice thing about the MAPS approach is that the kind of primary arc of what MAPS is doing with respect to getting FDA approval for MDMA right now is inherently limited by the medical system. So it comes with quality control and oversight and a lot of all these other things. And although I personally don't think that the medical system is the only one, and I think in fact it'd probably be harmful if we were only able to get medicine through the medical framework. I think there's a lot of limitations to it. I do feel like that there's aspects of that system that are really beneficial, like quality control, oversight, accountability, and so on. I do feel, I've been having my own experiences with psychedelics for about 15 years, and not just, for sure in the way that many young ravers have had at parties and celebrations and festivals, but also like with my family and on pilgrimages and in contexts that are much more mindful in therapeutic contexts and so on. My personal opinion is that psychedelics can help a lot of people. I do think that when they're held in the correct way with the right environment, which is different for different people and different needs, they can have a tremendous amount of benefit. I really hesitate calling myself an evangelical because I actually think it's extremely irresponsible to talk about psychedelics without mentioning the risks and harms. And I actually think it's equally irresponsible to make up risk and harms like DARE or Scruff McGruff did, because I actually think that increases it increases disinformation, which makes it harder for people to actually be safe. So from a personal perspective, like my approach is really like, what is the safest way that this kind of behavior can happen? And I come at it from a very harm reduction approach in the sense that, like, I don't think that we can stop drug use. You know, the UN special session on drugs in 1998 or 1997 met, and their slogan was a world without drugs. And I always like reflecting on that because I actually think it's like such a hysterically ridiculous possibility. Like, what does that even mean? People have been smoking opium for thousands of years, you know, like that's not going to change because like governments decide to criminalize it. It just means we're going to put a bunch of people in jail and hurt them. So I do believe that psychedelics can and do induce those feelings you were talking about of unity, of growth, of oneness, Like I absolutely believe that they can have that experience. But I think it's very naive to think that they are inherently good or inherently create some sort of moral value in people. And I do think, actually, I will caveat that with what you said about environmentalism. I actually do feel like there's something about psychedelics that bring a level of consciousnness to the environment, which does feel quite universal. Even beyond politics, like there's a lot of, you know, there are people who are like, there's a whole like subculture of psychedelic using kind of like pagan origin, like neo-Nazis in Europe, like it's a thing. And there are definitely people who use psychedelics for their own personal growth and amoral or kind of purely, you might say, like capitalistic or like, you know, resource acquisition oriented kind of ways. For sure. So I actually, and this goes to actually, I think one of the points that you made also in your question, which is like, I feel that way about the psychedelics themselves, the medicine. And there's like different arguments and conversations we can have about the level of consciousness some of these different substances and molecules have. But the other piece that you said, I actually think does have a tremendous moral value, which is the container in which it happens. And I think that like from a like social design perspective, how like the containers through which psychedelics become available is really the key question for me. So I feel like I am a little bit of evangelical for well-held containers in the sense that like, I think that, you know, that could be a ceremony, that could be a doctor's office with a therapist, that could be yourself and close friends, that could be like me and my family, you know, like there's ways to hold these containers in different ways, and there isn't like one right one for whatever. But I do think that like there is very little doubt in my mind that the container within which these substances happen has a huge effect on both the experience itself and also the long-term kind of effects of that experience on a person. And this really comes down to my own theory of change, which is about storytelling. Like, how do we heal? How do we create narratives to change things over time? So much of that for me is a process of storytelling, collective storytelling, individual narrative building, and so on. And in my mind, like to the extent that healing is a process of narrative building, like how do you re-relate or differently relate to something that happened to you in a way that changes the kind of like the story that you have about it, that allows you to reconsolidate, the term we use sometimes as memory reconsolidation. Like how do you remember something differently from the way that you were remembering it? That's a big question for people because it's not just the drugs. It's like, how do we think about our childhood? How do we think about parenting? How do we think about, you know, our ancestors? Like those are all things that do come up in the container. And I do, you know, I've dedicated my life. I feel very committed to this work. Like this is definitely not just a job for me. And I mean, in some ways it's like, it's work, and through the nonprofit industrial complex and philanthropy systems and blah, 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 you know, there's like the reality of working in like the system that we live in today. The possibility that psychedelics do offer does seem potentially tremendously transformative. And I feel like my role right now is making sure that we're thinking about some of these like stickier, more nuanced issues, because it'd be very easy to just like fit them into the like factory line of every other product that gets pushed out through every other way. And that's something that I really want to avoid, or at least make sure we're doing some very deep reflection around.
That's great. Ismail Ali, thank you so much for joining us on the Psychedelic Moment. It's been a great pleasure to listen and to learn from you.
I've been really appreciating this conversation. So thank you so much for the invitation, and glad to be here.
Thank you for listening to Voices of Esalen. Today's show is produced in conjunction with Terry Gilby, Michelle McCrary, and Michelle Broderick. Our music is by Nico Holloman. The Esalen Institute is a nonprofit organization. Our show is made possible by your contribution.